Thank you, Ihab, for this enriching paper and for abiding by the time. Ibrahim Rabaya is our next panelist. He works at the Palestinian Center for Research, and he's a graduate of the Malaya University in Malaysia, and he's a coach at the FIFA and the Center for Long Learning. He worked as a coordinator of planning in the international cooperation at the Ministry of Planning in Palestine, and he has a number of research papers, and he'll be talking about the sports establishment in occupied Palestine between the years of 1967 and 1995. Thank you, Dr. Iyad. Thank you, colleague Ihab. In fact, I'd like through this paper to look at the sports establishment in the OPT following the 1967
and the role of this at the social level and the Israeli imperial hegemony. Sport was present at its early stages through the participation in the Zionist movement with the registration of the Palestinian Federation FIFA in the 1920s, and at that time there were only a very limited number of clubs, and the subsequent team which was formed had no more than 2 Arab members, and this led to continuous confrontation by the Palestinian National Movement with FIFA and with Britain and other countries. Also, the Zionist movement has utilized the Maccabi clubs, which used to represent Jews in the world, and they used to organize international tournaments. In 1935, for example, the tournament led to the entering into Palestine 20,000 armed Jewish young men and women who were the backbone of the Haganah fighting militia later on. So this was the cover for unauthorized immigration into Palestine and was the backbone for the Haganah, which took part in the Nakba directly and openly. After 1967, sport was not an exception, definitely, and Israel started practicing or attempting to practice its total hegemony. And despite the feeling that they had total hegemony in the early years, the Palestinians, according to Dr. Majdi al-Maliki, started adapting and by way of resistance to this phenomena. This kind of adaptation based on resistance led the effort, and before 1967 at the level of sport there was 2 formations, one in Gaza, one the West Bank, because of the West Bank's link to Jordan and Gaza's link to Egypt, and there was a level of organization with Jordan, and in Gaza the Palestinian sporting movement had a degree of independence through federations and teams and clubs took part in the Arab Cup, which was the last participation of Palestine with a team mostly made up of Gazan players before 1966. And some Palestinian federations managed to get some international recognition at the level of basketball, but so far as football is concerned, the FIFA did not accept repeated Palestinian attempts and under different pretexts, which the FIFA did not accept to deal with messages coming from Gaza as part of the Palestinian state because they considered Gaza as an area or a strip, not a state. After 67, we saw three phases. The first, the restoring of activity after the shock of the setback of 1967, and through restoring sporting activity, especially in Nablus, and they started organizing tournaments. The Israeli occupation was restricting this kind of activities, and there were the formation of teams at the local level, which then afterwards developed into the level of federations and organizing committees with the military rule, which really assigned an officer to keep an eye on this movement. So this period also saw a degree of organization in the northern parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and in the middle and southern parts of the West Bank, like the Supervising Committee, the Union of Arab Clubs, and the Federation of Southern Clubs. They were very weak formations because they did not have enough representation. In this phase, there were other solutions by the clubs to activate the sporting movement through so-called al-sawa'aq or lightning tournaments, which were held on certain ceremonial occasions through some clubs, and then this became an annual tradition until Oslo. The second phase, which spanned specifically between 1979 and 1984, and this is the period where some sort of an institutionalization has taken place. They were keen not to use any traditional sporting names like a federation or committee, and this is for a very good reason, and that is Israel may not be using that to include and annex that to the Israeli federations and things. Of course, the West Bank preceded Gaza, and this was in 1980 by establishing the federations in both places, and this was in order to achieve some degree of coordination between the West Bank and Gaza, and there was an attempt to have similar articles of association and organizing system and rules and regulations, and the federations of the West Bank and Gaza coordinated, and they had a joint organizing committee, and they managed to hold like a tournament between teams from both places. And the first General League in Palestine in 1980, and a preliminary one first, and then one based on some sort of ranking. And the third stage is the political presence of sporting organizations in the occupied territories, which came after 1983-84. And this period is largely ignored in the context of studying the preparation for the Intifada, because the Federation was a place of incubation for activities which led to the Intifada, but now we have a new group of citizens who are the youth who engaged in voluntary work, which was the cover for political mobilization through these clubs. Also, the matches provided a cover for the symbols of the Intifada to move from one city to another, which is very difficult, let alone moving between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Even to move to attend a match, the spectators were only allowed to go to the stadiums. Anybody who went outside would be arrested, but the symbols of the national movement used this opportunity to coordinate their efforts between Gaza and the West Bank, and this was part of the process of adaptation through resistance. After 1982, and in this phase, the municipalities were disbanded, and there was the need for some sort of organization. So clubs became the form of providing services for like education, health, and infrastructure. Also, there is this what explains the increase in the number of clubs from 60 to some 260, because these clubs were organizations using sport as a cover to engage in political activity directly. Gaza in the 80s was in direct contact with the occupied territory and the PLO, Occupied Territories Organization, and the PLO, especially after the expulsion of PLO from Beirut. And it's said that one of the leaders of the federation in Gaza was arrested and for 68 days and put in a refrigerator for 3 days to force him to reveal how he was maintaining contacts with the national movement and transferring funds. The clubs allowed for developing a youth movement which was transferred into a widespread popular movement, and active incubators for like the youth committees, which what later on became the youth organizing committees. The martyr Muhammad Abu Matkur was a famous personality, and in Rafah, Abu Ali Shaheen started the club in Rafah, and the club was closed for 10 years by the Israeli occupation. Also, Abu Matkur, one of the well-known stories is he sold his private car to fund the National Assembly's meeting in Amman in 1984, which was the National Assembly held under difficult circumstances after the PLO's expulsion from Beirut. In the second half of the 1980s, some clubs were closed for 10 years, and some athletes were targeted while they are on the pitch. Jamal Shweiki was targeted and martyred when a number of the Israeli units undercover who operate under the disguise of wearing Arab attires, and they killed him on the pitch, on the grounds of the stadium. And after that, sports personalities engaged in the national movement, and Israel noticed that and closed all the clubs, and some were arrested, like Ayman Sanduqa, who was the striker of the national team and the coach of the Palestinian youth team. He was arrested from the stadium and imprisoned for 16 years. Israel also used to continuously interrogate and arrest and intimidate the officials of the clubs, and the West Bank. They used to be held in a detention center called Al Far'a. After Oslo, this was transferred into a youth city, and some players, and this on its own is some kind of a symbolism, and the sporting personalities become activists later in the places where they were held and detained. And also Israel used to fire some members when they say that they violated the rules and regulations, and sometimes arrest them, not just sack them. Some of the important events was the arrest of 65 Palestinians in a center in Calandia for watching a nationalist film, and also storming the Al Yarmouk Stadium, where there were tens of thousands of spectators, and the pretext of one spectator out of the few thousand had a gun.
Yes, indeed. The club represents the community, and in the Doha camp in the southern parts of the West Bank, next to Bethlehem, a number of officers met the dignitaries of the camp, and they wanted to have a truce with the camp, but the youngsters who represented the center said that we are representative of the camps, and the dignitaries cannot speak on our behalf, and the meeting has been a failure, and one of the youngsters were exiled to Jordan. The club plays a role in elections as well, because they represented the different parties in Silwan, in Jerusalem, in Doha, and in the competition between the factions of the PLO, Fatah, and the Popular Front. And these competitions were neck to neck, and the West Bank usually used to watch what goes on. The Silwan club is very famous, and it usually have the attire whereby the jerseys carry the Palestinian flag. And up to this moment, when Silwan plays against a Gaza club, it represented a political festival, and the clubs were keen on organizing matches in Jerusalem, followed by demonstrations, and often following the matches, demonstrations will be organized to support the PLO, especially when it was besieged in 1982 in Beirut. As far as security in the Palestinian stadia at the time was better than today's because we have kind of self-censorship in the past, and the sporting movement has been more valuable. Uh, there was also uh, there were different centers that played a role in hosting the youngsters at night, and the figures of the liberation movement under the light of candles to prepare for next day's movement. With the advent of the Intifada, the uprising, we or popular kind of uh, places were surfacing, and the popular committees organized the daily life of the inhabitants of Gaza and the West Bank, and represented an internal kind of national pattern away from the Israeli intervention. The popular committees were the heirs of the charitable organizations. Thank you.